Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt something was fundamentally wrong with it? Not in the obvious ways. Not the stiff poses or the dead eyes that came from holding still for minutes at a time. I mean something deeper. Something that makes your skin crawl even though you can't quite name what's disturbing you. I need to tell you about the Alcott family of Charleston, South Carolina. About what I found in the ruins of their estate. About why, even now, I can't look at a portrait without feeling my heart race. It was October of 1861 when everything began to unravel. The war had just started, though Charleston society still pretended normalcy could be maintained through afternoon teas and portrait sittings. The Alcotts were old money, cotton fortune built on blood and suffering, though they'd never acknowledge it. Thaddeus Alcott, the patriarch, had commissioned a series of family portraits from a traveling photographer named Silas Crane. Crane wasn't from Charleston. Nobody knew exactly where he'd come from, only that he'd appeared one day with his wagon full of chemicals and glass plates, setting up shop in a narrow building on Meeting Street. His work was extraordinary, somehow more lifelike than anything the local photographers produced. The subjects in his portraits seemed ready to step out of the frame and continue their lives. The Alcotts were to be his masterwork. 7 portraits in total. Thaddeus himself, his wife Margaret, their 3 children, Augustus, 19, Cordelia, 17, and young Theodore, just 11, plus Thaddeus's elderly mother Constance, and Margaret's sister Judith who lived with them. The first sitting was on October 15th. Thaddeus went alone to Crane's studio, a cramped space that reeked of silver nitrate and something else, something organic and wrong that Thaddeus would later describe in his journal as the smell of fruit rotting in darkness. The sitting took 3 hours. Far longer than usual, but Crane was a perfectionist. When Thaddeus returned home that evening, Margaret noticed immediately that something was off. He seemed dazed, his movements mechanical. When she asked about the sitting, he could barely remember it. "There was a flash," he said slowly. "And then I was walking home." The portrait was delivered 2 days later. Margaret screamed when she unwrapped it. The man in the photograph wasn't her husband. Oh, he wore Thaddeus's clothes, sat in Thaddeus's pose, but the face was that of a stranger. Younger, perhaps, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a malevolence Thaddeus had never possessed. Yet when she called Thaddeus to look, he saw nothing wrong. "It's a fine likeness," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Crane has captured me perfectly." But Margaret knew her husband's face. She'd traced its lines with her fingers for 23 years. This wasn't him. She tried to convince herself it was the photographic process, some trick of light and chemistry. But that night, she woke to find Thaddeus standing at their bedroom window, staring out at nothing. When she called his name, he didn't respond for a full minute. When he finally turned, his face in the moonlight looked different. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to wonder if she was going mad. The next portrait was to be Margaret herself. She tried to refuse, claimed illness, but Thaddeus insisted with an urgency that wasn't like him. "The family portrait series must be complete," he said, his voice flat. "Crane insists on it." She went to the studio on October 20th. The building seemed darker than it should be, as if the shadows inside were thicker, more substantial than ordinary darkness. Crane was a tall, thin man with long fingers that moved like spider legs as he adjusted his equipment. His face was forgettable. So forgettable that even as Margaret looked at him, she found she couldn't quite hold his features in her mind. "Please sit very still, Mrs. Alcott," he said, his voice like wind through empty rooms. "This process requires absolute stillness, absolute surrender." The chair was cold despite the warm October day. Crane disappeared behind his camera, and Margaret found herself staring into the lens, a black eye that seemed to grow larger the longer she looked at it. The smell Thaddeus had mentioned was overwhelming, sweet decay mixed with something chemical and sharp. "Look deeper, Mrs. Alcott," Crane whispered. "Look past the surface. See what lies beneath." The flash, when it came, wasn't like any photographic flash she'd experienced. It was darkness, a burst of absolute black that somehow seared itself into her vision. In that moment of blindness, she felt something shift. Something fundamental. Something that had always been her was suddenly elsewhere. When her vision cleared, Crane was helping her from the chair. 3 hours had passed, though it felt like seconds. Or centuries. She couldn't be sure. That night, Thaddeus didn't recognize her when she came to bed. Oh, he pretended to, went through the motions, but she caught him staring at her with confusion, even fear. And in the mirror, just at the edge of her vision, she sometimes glimpsed a face that wasn't quite her own. Augustus was next. The eldest son, pride of the Alcott line, recently returned from West Point to join the Confederate cause. He was everything a Southern gentleman should be, tall, proud, with their mother's delicate features and their father's iron will. The war hadn't touched him yet, hadn't carved away the softness that privilege provides. He went to Crane's studio on October 23rd, wearing his new gray uniform. Margaret begged him not to go. She'd seen her own portrait by then. Another stranger's face staring back at her with eyes that knew things she'd never learned. But Augustus laughed off her concerns. "Mother, you're letting the war make you nervous. It's just a photograph." But Margaret had started noticing things. The servants wouldn't meet their eyes anymore. The house felt different, charged with electricity that made the air hard to breathe. And Thaddeus had begun speaking in his sleep. Not words she recognized, not any language she'd ever heard. Sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, deeper than his chest. Sounds that made the windows rattle in their frames. Augustus returned from the studio pale and sweating. He locked himself in his room and wouldn't come out for dinner. When Margaret pressed her ear to his door, she heard him whispering urgently, frantically, as if in conversation with someone. But when she finally convinced him to open the door, he was alone. "Did you see?" he asked her, gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "In the lens? Did you see what looks back?" Before she could answer, Thaddeus appeared in the doorway. But the way he moved, too fluid, as if his bones had been replaced with something more flexible. "The portrait session went well," he said, though Augustus hadn't told him about it. "Crane is pleased with the progress." Progress toward what? Margaret wanted to ask, but the words died in her throat when she saw Thaddeus's shadow on the wall. It didn't match his movements. It seemed to have too many angles, too many joints. Cordelia's sitting was scheduled for October 25th. Beautiful Cordelia, who'd had suitors lining up since she was 15. She'd been excited about the portrait initially, imagined how elegant she'd look captured forever in her blue silk dress. But she'd grown quiet as the date approached, spending hours staring at the family portraits already completed. "They're wrong," she whispered to Margaret the night before her sitting. "Look at Father's eyes in the photograph. Count them." Margaret looked. 2 eyes, of course. What else would there be? But the longer she stared, the more uncertain she became. There seemed to be suggestions of other eyes, half hidden in the shadows of the photograph. Eyes that opened when she wasn't looking directly at them. Cordelia went to her sitting dressed in white instead of blue. "For mourning," she said, though no one had died. Not yet. Not in any way that could be explained. She was gone for 5 hours. When she returned, she wasn't speaking. Not couldn't, wouldn't. She moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps making no sound. And sometimes Margaret swore she saw her daughter in 2 places at once. In the parlor and the garden simultaneously. Each version slightly different, as if one was a reflection that had learned to exist independently. Young Theodore refused to go. He was only 11 but had always been sensitive, prone to nightmares and strange pronouncements. He'd taken one look at Crane when the photographer came to collect him and had screamed, a sound no child should be able to make. "He has no face," Theodore shrieked. "Under the skin, he has no face." Thaddeus had to physically carry the boy to the studio. Margaret tried to intervene, but when she touched her husband's arm to stop him, his skin felt wrong. Too cold. Too smooth. As if something underneath was wearing Thaddeus like a suit. They were gone all night. When they returned, Theodore was changed. Not obviously, he still looked like a boy, acted like a boy, but his shadow fell the wrong way. His reflection in mirrors lagged a half-second behind his movements. and he'd developed a habit of staring at corners of rooms, watching something no one else could see. "They're coming through," he told Margaret one night, his young voice eerily calm. "The portraits are doors, and something's walking through them." Constance Alcott, Thaddeus's mother, had lived through 73 years of Charleston history. She'd survived yellow fever, the death of 2 husbands, and the loss of 4 children in infancy. Nothing frightened her, or so she claimed, but she'd been avoiding the parlor where the completed portraits hung. "Those aren't my family," she told Margaret on the morning of October 28th, the day of her own sitting. "I don't know what they are, but they're not my blood." She was right, of course. Margaret had finally admitted it to herself. The faces in the portraits were strangers. Beautiful, terrible strangers who wore her family's clothes and posed in their positions but were fundamentally other. And worse, her actual family was beginning to resemble those portraits more each day. Augustus had started moving with a predatory grace that he'd never possessed. His eyes had taken on the cold calculation of his photograph double. Cordelia's beauty had sharpened into something that hurt to look at directly. Even little Theodore seemed to be aging in reverse, his features becoming more angular, more knowing. Constance went to her sitting armed with a silver cross that had been in the family for generations. Margaret watched from the window as the old woman entered Crane's studio. For a moment, just as the door closed, she thought she saw the building expand, as if it were breathing in, drawing Constance into its dark belly. The screaming started an hour later. Not Constance's voice, something that might have been Constance's voice if it were played backward, if it were forced through throats that weren't meant for human speech. The sound went on for another hour before stopping abruptly. Constance returned home silent, her silver cross blackened as if it had been burned. She went straight to her room and began writing frantically in her journal. Page after page of text in languages that shifted and changed, English to Latin to something older, something that made Margaret's eyes water to read. When she finally stopped writing, 12 hours later, she turned to Margaret with eyes that held terrible knowledge. "I saw where they come from," she whispered. "The other side of the glass. Crane isn't taking our pictures. He's trading us." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, Judith's sitting day arrived. Margaret's sister had always been the practical one, the skeptic who believed in nothing that couldn't be measured and weighed. She'd dismissed the family's growing terror as mass hysteria. "You're all letting your imaginations run wild," she declared on the morning of October 30th. "I'll go to this sitting and prove there's nothing supernatural about Mr. Crane or his photographs." But even Judith had begun showing signs of unease. She'd started sleeping with the lights on. She'd moved out of the guest room that faced the parlor where the portraits hung. And she'd taken to carrying a pair of scissors in her pocket, though she couldn't explain why. The studio was different when Judith arrived. Margaret had insisted on accompanying her, and what they found made them both stop at the threshold. The space had grown larger, impossibly larger. The single room now stretched back into shadows that seemed to go on forever. And the smell had changed from rotting fruit to something metallic and hot, like blood on summer stone. Crane emerged from the darkness, and for the first time, Margaret truly saw him. Not his face, that remained stubbornly impossible to fix in memory, but his nature. He wasn't human, might never have been human. He was something that had learned to approximate human shape, but underneath the disguise was something vast and hungry and patient. "Ah, the final portrait," he said, his voice coming from everywhere at once. "The set will finally be complete." "What are you?" Judith demanded, her skepticism crumbling into terror. Crane tilted his head at an angle that necks shouldn't achieve. "I am a doorway," he said simply, "and your family has been chosen to walk through." The sitting lasted 7 hours. Margaret waited outside, listening to sounds that couldn't possibly come from human throats. When Judith finally emerged, she was laughing. Not with joy, with the kind of madness that comes from seeing too much truth at once. "We're already gone," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Don't you see? We've been gone since the first portrait. We're just echoes, waiting to fade." That night, Halloween Eve, The Alcott family gathered in the parlor for the unveiling of the complete portrait series. None of them wanted to be there, but something compelled them. The same force that had been growing stronger since Thaddeus's first sitting. They moved like marionettes, their bodies responding to invisible strings. The 7 portraits were arranged in a perfect line along the wall. Each showed a stranger wearing familiar clothes, sitting in familiar poses. But now, with all of them together, a pattern emerged. The eyes of each portrait were focused on the same point, a spot in the center of the room where the air seemed to shimmer. Crane stood beside the portraits, his form more solid than it had ever been. "The transaction is nearly complete," he announced. "Your essences have been captured, distilled, and sent through. And in return, the portraits began to move. Subtle at first, a shift of expression, a turn of the head. Then more dramatically, the strangers in the photographs were standing, pressing against the inside of the glass, their hands leaving prints that somehow appeared on the outside of the frames. Theodore was the first to understand. Despite his youth, or perhaps because of it, he saw what the adults couldn't accept. "We're being replaced," he said quietly. "Those things in the portraits, they're going to come out and we're going to go in." Thaddeus tried to deny it, but his words came out in that strange language he'd been speaking in his sleep. Margaret reached for her children, but her hands passed through them as if they were made of mist. They were fading, becoming transparent, while the portraits grew more vivid, more real. Constance pulled out her journal, reading from the frantic notes she'd made. "The photography process doesn't capture souls. It trades them. Crane comes from a place where beings of immense power are trapped in 2 dimensions, imprisoned in flat reality. They need 3-dimensional vessels to escape. And we're being compressed, flattened, prepared to take their places in that paper-thin hell." The shimmer in the center of the room intensified, becoming a vortex of light and shadow. Through it, Margaret could see another place. A vast gallery of portraits stretching to infinity, each containing a person pounding silently on the inside of their frame, screaming to be released. "It's not just us," Augustus said, his military bearing finally crumbling. "Look." They turned to the window. Outside, all of Charleston seemed to be fading. Every family who'd had their portrait taken by Crane, every person who'd sat in his chair and stared into his lens, they were all becoming translucent, while somewhere their photograph doubles were gaining substance. Cordelia, who hadn't spoken since her sitting, finally found her voice. But what came out wasn't English. It was the language of that other place, that flat dimension where everything existed in only 2 directions. Her words created visible ripples in the air, distortions that hurt to perceive. "She's already partly there," Judith observed with the detached interest of the deeply traumatized. "We all are. Look at your hands." Margaret looked down. Her hands were flattening, losing depth. She could see through them to the floor below, but more disturbing, she could see them from angles that shouldn't exist, as if she were viewing herself from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The portraits were stepping out of their frames now. The stranger who wore Thaddeus's face emerged first, his movements jerky as he adjusted to 3-dimensional space. His eyes, definitely more than 2 now, swept the room with predatory interest. "Finally," he said in a voice like grinding glass. 500 years we've waited. 500 years trapped in that flat hell, watching your world through windows we couldn't break. Until Crane. Dear Crane, who learned to build bridges between dimensions." The real Thaddeus tried to speak, but his voice came out as a whisper that seemed to exist in only 2 dimensions, width and height, with no depth to give it substance. He was becoming exactly what they were escaping from. The Margaret thing emerged next, her beauty terrible and wrong, as if someone had tried to paint perfection without understanding humanity. She moved toward the real Margaret, and where they touched, Margaret felt herself compress, flatten, her very existence losing a dimension. "Please," Margaret begged, but the word came out as a static image, a frozen moment of sound that hung in the air like a photograph. One by one, the portrait beings emerged. The Augustus thing with its cold intelligence. The Cordelia thing with its sharp beauty. The Theodore thing that looked like a child but moved with ancient purpose. The Constance thing whose elderly facade barely contained the power within. The Judith thing with its mockery of skepticism. As each emerged, their real counterpart faded further, becoming more portrait-like. Margaret could feel her thoughts flattening, becoming simple, two-dimensional. Complex emotions reduced to basic expressions that could be captured in a still image. "Why?" she managed to ask, though the question appeared as written text in the air rather than sound. Crane, still standing by the portraits, laughed, a sound like paper tearing. "Because your world has depth, sensation, time that moves in more than one direction. You take it for granted, but for beings trapped in flatness, it's paradise. And your portraits, your compressed selves, will serve as windows for others to follow." An endless exchange. Theodore, poor young Theodore, was almost completely flat now. He looked like a drawing of himself, his features simplified to basic lines and shadows. "Mother," he said, and the word appeared as a caption beneath him, as if he were already a photograph. The portrait beings were fully formed now, testing their new bodies with obvious delight. They touched surfaces, marveled at shadows that fell in 3 dimensions, breathed air that had volume. The Thaddeus thing picked up a book, amazed that it could turn pages instead of seeing all of them at once in a flat spread. "The beauty of it," Crane continued, "is that no one will know. These beings will live your lives, perhaps better than you did. They've been studying you, learning you. They know your memories, your mannerisms. Charleston society will never notice the difference." And the horrifying thing was, he was probably right. The portrait beings were perfect copies on the surface. Only someone who truly knew the Alcotts would sense something wrong, and even then, who would believe them? Constance, with the wisdom of her years, made one last desperate attempt. She pulled out a knife. Where had she gotten a knife? And slashed at her portrait. But the blade passed through harmlessly. She was already too insubstantial to affect the physical world. "You can't stop it," the Constance thing said with mock sympathy. "The process is irreversible. You're becoming art, and we're becoming life. It's almost poetic." As midnight approached, the transformation accelerated. Margaret watched her family becoming portraits before her eyes. Augustus stood frozen in a military pose, his form completely flat against the wall. Cordelia had been reduced to a beautiful image, her depth compressed into height and width alone. Theodore was just a drawing of a boy, his innocence captured in simple lines. But the worst part wasn't the physical transformation. It was the mental one. Margaret could feel her thoughts simplifying, her complex emotions reducing to what could be expressed in a single, frozen moment. Love became a positioned hand. Fear became widened eyes. Entire ranges of human experience compressed into gestures that could be captured in still images. The portrait beings, meanwhile, were discovering the joys of 3-dimensional existence. The Margaret thing ran her fingers through real hair, marveling at each individual strand. The Thaddeus thing poured whiskey and watched it swirl, amazed by fluid dynamics. The Theodore thing jumped, delighting in the arc of motion through space. "You'll exist forever, you know," Crane told the fading family. "Preserved perfectly in your frames. Conscious, aware, but unable to change, unable to grow. Living photographs in a gallery no one will ever visit." Margaret wanted to scream, but screams don't exist in portraits. She could only widen her painted eyes, position her drawn mouth in a silent O of horror. She was becoming art, conscious art, trapped art, eternal art. Judith made a final observation before her voice fully flattened. "The dates. Look at the dates on our portraits." Margaret managed to turn her flattening head. Each portrait was dated, but not October 1861. They were dated from different years: 1361, 1561, 1661, 1761, as if the portrait beings had been waiting 100 years between each opportunity to escape. "We're not the first," Judith's text appeared in the air. "And we won't be the last." Crane nodded approvingly. "Every century, I find a new family. 7 members, always 7. A complete set to trade places. The portrait beings live out their stolen lives, die human deaths, and new ones take their places in the flat dimension, waiting for their turn to escape. The vortex in the center of the room pulsed, and Margaret saw through to that other place more clearly. Thousands of portraits lined impossible galleries that existed in only 2 dimensions. Families from across centuries, all trapped in their frames, all pounding silently on glass that would never break. She saw a Roman family from the 1st century, their togas perfectly preserved in paint. A Chinese dynasty from the 7th century, their silk robes captured in impossible detail. Victorian families, Renaissance nobles, Aboriginal tribes, all compressed into flatness, all conscious, all screaming silently for release that would never come. Art is suffering, Crane said philosophically, and suffering is eternal. The clock began to strike midnight. With each chime, the Alcotts lost more dimension. First, movement ceased, then depth vanished, then even the illusion of depth faded. By the 6th chime, they were completely flat. By the 9th, they were in their frames. By the 12th, the frames were hanging on the wall where the portraits had been. But they were still conscious, still aware. Margaret could see the room, but only from one angle, the angle of her portrait. She could see the portrait beings living in their stolen bodies, but couldn't turn her head to follow them. She was frozen in a moment of genteel composure, her painted face showing none of the horror she felt. The portrait beings settled into their new lives with disturbing ease. Within days, they had perfectly assumed the Alcott's roles in Charleston society. The Thaddeus Thing managed the estate with cold efficiency. The Margaret Thing hosted teas with mechanical precision. The Augustus Thing joined the Confederate Army, eager to experience war in 3 dimensions. No one noticed the difference, or if they did, they dismissed their unease. After all, the war was changing everyone. Who could say what was normal anymore? The real Alcotts hung in their frames, watching their lives being lived by imposters. They couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even close their eyes. They existed in a state of perpetual observation, seeing everything from their fixed positions. Margaret watched the Margaret Thing sleep in her bed, wear her clothes, kiss her husband's stolen face. She watched seasons change through the parlor window, spring to summer to fall to winter, years spinning by while she remained frozen in October 1861. The portrait beings aged, had children, lived full lives. The Augustus Thing died at Gettysburg, experiencing death as a revelation. The Theodore Thing grew into manhood, married, had portrait children of his own. The Cordelia Thing became a widow, then a grandmother, then a corpse. But the real Alcotts remained unchanged in their frames. Visitors would sometimes comment on the remarkable portraits, how lifelike they seemed. If they looked closely, they might notice that the eyes seemed to follow them, because they did. The conscious, trapped, screaming souls of the Alcott family watched every visitor, begging silently to be noticed, to be saved. Decades passed. The portrait beings died and were replaced by their descendants, who were really descendants of stolen lives. The house changed hands, was renovated, demolished, rebuilt. But the portraits survived, moved from estate sales to antique shops to museums. And still the Alcotts watched. Still they screamed without sound. In 1961, 100 years after their imprisonment, the portraits ended up in a private collection in Boston. The collector, an old woman named Sarah Hartley, had a gift for sensing the stories in old things. She hung the Alcott portraits in her study and would spend hours looking at them. "There's something about these," she told her nephew once. "Something trapped inside. Look at the eyes, they're too aware." She was right, of course. Margaret tried desperately to communicate, to somehow signal their plight. But she was paint and canvas now, nothing more. At least, nothing more that could be perceived from the 3-dimensional world. Sarah died in 1973, and the portraits were sold again. This time to a museum in Charleston, returning them to where it all began. They were hung in a recreation of a period parlor, labeled simply, "The Alcott Family, 1861, photographer unknown." Visitors would pass through, admiring the craftsmanship, the attention to detail. Children on school trips would giggle at the formal poses. Art students would sketch copies, trying to capture the technique. None of them knew they were looking at conscious beings. None of them could hear the screaming. But sometimes, late at night, when the museum was closed and the security guard was doing his rounds, he would swear he heard something. A sound like whispers from very far away, or cries muffled by impossible distance. He would shine his flashlight on the portraits, and for just a moment, he could swear the eyes moved. Not side to side, not up and down, but in a direction that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. A desperate attempt to escape into dimensions that portraits could never access. The guard would shake his head, continue his rounds, and try to forget the feeling that something in those paintings was desperately, eternally alive. And in their frames, the Alcotts continued their silent screams. They had become what Crane promised, eternal art, preserved forever in a moment of perfect composition. A family portrait that showed strangers wearing familiar faces, while the real family watched from behind paint and canvas, trapped in a flat hell that no one else could see. Somewhere, Crane continued his work. New families, new portraits, new trades between dimensions. 100 years would pass and he would return. 7 new portraits. 7 new prisoners. 7 new escapes from the flat dimension. The gallery of trapped souls grew ever larger, spreading across impossible geometries that existed in only 2 dimensions. Each portrait a window, each window a prison, each prison a conscious, screaming work of art that would never, ever be free. And if you look carefully at old portraits, really look with the kind of attention that most people can't maintain, you might see it too. The awareness that shouldn't be there. The consciousness trapped in paint. The horrible truth that some art doesn't imitate life. Sometimes it replaces it. The Alcott family hangs in the Charleston Museum to this day. 7 portraits in a row, perfectly preserved, their eyes following every visitor with desperate, eternal attention. They'll hang there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, forever watching, forever screaming, forever trapped in frames that show strangers, never them. Because that's what Crane promised, and Crane always keeps his promises. Art is suffering, and suffering, true suffering, is eternal.